The National Bureau of Statistics on Thursday reported that Nigeria's inflation rate has dropped to 33.40%, marking the first decline in 19 months. The decrease from 34.19% in June was attributed to a significant fall in food prices. NBS noted that the headline inflation rate decreased by 0.8 percentage points. The food inflation rate in July was 39.53% year-on-year, up 12.55 percentage points from July of 2023. The rise was due to increase in prices of items like semovita, yam flour, and wheat flour. However, the decline in inflation was attributed to drops in prices of items such as tin milk, baby powdered milk, and fresh fish. On a year-on-year basis, the headline inflation rate was 9.32 percentage points higher than in July of 2023. Month-on-month, the July headline inflation rate was 2.28%, a 0.03% decrease from June. Professor Uche Uwaleke, Director of the Institute of Capital Market Studies, Nasarawa State University, KEFI, joins us for a chat around this. Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us here on Newsday.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My pleasure.
Now, some say that the recent drop in inflation rate seems rather counterintuitive given current economic conditions. What specific factors, apart from what we've already outlined, do you think also contributed significantly to this decrease?
Well, it's obvious. I'm sure if you went round recently, as recent as 3 weeks, 4 weeks back, and even up till now, you would notice that the prices of certain food items, have begun to, climb down. Talking about yams, tubers, talking about potatoes. A basket of potato that used to go for 15,000, 16,000 today, has come down to as low as 5,000, 6,000, depending on where you're buying. The same with Gary and a few others. So it's obvious what has led to this significant drop rather. I wouldn't say significant, or is it significant because you're looking at food inflation dropping from about 41 to 40, but it's a drop all the same. So I'm saying it's obvious that what has brought about that, is largely attributable to the harvest season that we are in, and you can also trace that to some of the measures the government took in the recent past, measures to do with distributing fertilizers and some other farm inputs to farmers. I'm sure that is what we are seeing. So the harvest season is what is rubbing off positively on the inflation number. And the NBS data is very clear on that. It says that food inflation dropped from about 41 to 40. The headline inflation is a component of two items. You have the core and you have the food. Okay? Whereas core inflation actually increased. If you check, core inflation increased from 21.4 to 21.47. So it actually increased. Okay, but food inflation is what dragged down the headline inflation rates because it came down. So it's obvious what led to it. The fact that the harvest season is here, and the fact that we have increased supply of food items in the market.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like us to clarify to the viewers, particularly because food inflation has reduced and inflation has reduced, but this means that prices are still increasing. They're just increasing at a slower rate. Now, a lot of our inflationary pressures, as you stated, does come from food inflation, and we've seen food inflation across the country. We have different numbers. It can be as high as 40% in some states, and it's lower than 30% in others. Now, what would you say is driving food inflation at this point in time? And do you believe that this reduction in the inflation rate, to the fact that the food prices are increasing but at a slower rate, do you think that we should give this credit to the Central Bank of Nigeria? Or do you think that other factors are at play?
Well, you mentioned it. When we say disinflation, disinflation is actually a situation in which prices are rising but at a slower pace. So it would appear that we are about to witness the onset of disinflation. That means deceleration in prices. This is the first time, as you also pointed out in your introductory statement, that the headline inflation is coming down in 19 months since December 22, December of 2022, when it was 21.3%. Okay, and what has largely caused this, as I noted earlier, has to do with the fact that food prices, are beginning to come down. And just as you said, yes, you will have disparities in even the food inflation rate. But remember too, we are talking about the average of the average for 740 commodities that is in the basket, the MBS basket. And in terms of, variations, we've seen food inflation rate as high as 46% in places like Sokoto. I think Sokoto recorded the highest food inflation rate, whereas lower inflation food inflation figures, we saw them in places like Adamawa, places like Benue State. But that axis, that northwest west axis, Sokoto, Kebbi, Jigawa, recorded very high food inflation rates. And that may not be unconnected with the fact that even as we speak, I'm sure you have read that the area, the region, experienced a drought. And that may have also caused the shortfalls. So basically, in markets where you have increased supply, of course, you should expect that the prices will come down. But a major factor to driving food inflation in Nigeria today, the question you asked, has to do with the cost of transport. All right. Of course, it fits into food inflation, and to also see why. Even in the numbers MBS released, we can also see why, and we can see it in the fact that rural inflation rate is actually on the rise. If you look at that MBS number, rural inflation rate, actually increased. All right. Whereas urban inflation rate is, dropped. Okay, for last month, rural inflation rate increased. So that tells you that the transport challenge, moving goods, moving farm products from, the farms to where they are sold, is usually an issue. Has been an issue, and that pressure point we can also see in the fact that core inflation, increased, as opposed to the food that reduced. And if you look at the 12 divisions that are published by the National Bureau of Statistics, what their report they've categorized that into 12 divisions. The first division, the first thing you find there is food and non-alcoholic beverages, accounting for 17.39% of the total inflation figure of that 3.4. So that's over 50%, followed by fuel, electricity, gas, and housing at 5.59%. Then you have clothing, I think 2.5%, and then transport 2.17. So I've given you the major ones, okay? So you now notice that the challenge we are having in transport, the challenge we are having in energy, fuel, okay? These challenges rub off negatively on inflation generally, particularly food, because, as I said, we see the cost of fuel in transport, and we see the cost of transport in moving food from point A to point B. So in a nutshell, that's the major driver. And I think talking about sustainability, for us to sustain this trend, this disinflation, this downward trend, okay, we also need to fix these other issues that I mentioned, talking about transport, talking about fuel, energy, especially now that we're also beginning to see, the energy challenge, coming up again with the recent fuel scarcity and fuel queues all over the place. Of course, you should expect that will also impact the inflation number we are likely to get for the month of August, of course, which will be, NBS will be reporting by September.
So much, Professor. I've noted many salient points, like you're saying, harvest season is rubbing off on this positive inflation data that we're seeing, or positively on the inflation data, and also you talked about sustainability, which is regarding fixing the issues that you mentioned, like transport and energy. But I'm just wondering, how might this drop in inflation impact the Central Bank of Nigeria's monetary policy decisions, specifically when it comes to interest rates?
Okay, well, as I said earlier on, for me, the best approach to tackling inflation in Nigeria is to use the evidence. And what is the evidence? That evidence contains in the data that the National Bureau of Statistics has released. And what is the data saying? The data is very simple, or rather it's very clear, that the major driver of inflation is, the pressure point is food. Okay, so if you take out the 4 major divisions I mentioned earlier, there are 12 divisions, right? From food, the first one, 17.79, down to the last one, which is communications, coming in at 0.23. The first 4 will give you around 28%, of the pressure, 28% of 33.4. So imagine dealing with that 28%. That will significantly crash inflation number to single-digit level, which of course is the desire of the central bank. Now, the central bank's target of 21.4 for 2024, of course, from every indication appears a tall order. If we are doing that 3.4 as of July, that means it's not likely we are going to get anywhere near 21.4, by December. And what has been the approach of the central bank to dealing with this inflation challenge? It's been, since February this year, it's been to raise the monetary policy rates, aggressive monetary policy rate hikes, such that thus far we have seen between February and July, okay, an increase in the MPR by as much as 800 basis points. Okay, so for me that's been too aggressive, and I also think that it also is also rubbing off one way or the other on output, because remember, the full thing too has to do with supply, and output, should be encouraged for us to have increased supply. So when the central bank is raising rates the way, in an aggressive manner, it's hurting production, it's hurting output, and of course, indirectly too, it's affecting, the inflation, thing generally. So I think the way to go now, going forward, for the central bank, their next scheduled meeting of the MPCs in September, is to halt rates. The rates are already high, the way they are. MPR today is 26.75%, and that's not the whole story. The whole story, you get the true picture when you add the asymmetric corridor of +5. That means effectively the central bank lends to commercial banks at 31.75%. That's close to 32%. And you can imagine what the of course, commercial banks will now on-lend for rates that are much, much higher. So in this kind of situation, you would expect output to tank. And that is why if you also check the PMI reading, since June last year, okay, the Purchasing Managers Index, which is an indication of manufacturing activity, the reading has been under 50. Under 50, and when it's under 50, it means the output is contracting. It's only when it's ahead of 50, above 50, that you talk about expansion in output. And as I said earlier on, for 13 consecutive months, the PMI reading, the data is published by the central bank, has been under 50. Okay, and to also see that output is not doing well, you look at even the latest National Bureau of Statistics figure for GDP report for the first quarter of 2024. Okay, what does it say? It also says that GDP fell from 3.5%, about 3.5% in the last quarter of 2023 to 2.98% in first quarter of this year. Okay, so that tells you that GDP is dropping. But again, for me, what's even worrisome is that the productive sectors, the sectors that will even help to bring down this inflation, are not growing. If you look at the agri sector, for example, the agri sector, if you check that MBS report, the agri sector only grew by 0.18%. The manufacturing sector grew by 1.49%. We can't really be, be hopeful, optimistic about increased production, using this, grim figures, grim numbers. So the best way to tackle inflation, I repeat, is to look at the drivers, which is food, and to see how we can address that. The government's already doing a lot in that direction, and I'm optimistic that in the next couple of months, those will bring results. The first, we hear about the removal of import duty on essential food items, the waiver, okay? So that's expected to kick in any moment. You also, of course, you heard about the removal of import duty on pharmaceuticals, all right? And then the issue of the rollout of CNG buses. If CNG buses, come on board, and we should expect that transport costs will, should go down, particularly if the CNG arrangement also includes, utility vehicles. So I think that's the way to go. What's the role of the central bank in all this? Of course, the central bank has the primary responsibility to maintain, price stability, talking about not just inflation, but exchange rate, the trade prices, and also interest rate. So what should the central bank be doing in all this? Of course, they have been tightening policy because, of course, for obvious reasons, ways and means that came into the system, must have fueled money supply. But I am saying, my argument is that it is time to pause rate hikes. Central bank too can also be involved in some way, some sort of support to the fiscal side to boost agric. In the past, central bank used to intervene, in the agric sector, especially used through many programs, commercial agriculture credit scheme, the notable ones, anchor borrower scheme. But yes, those schemes were abused. There were a lot of, corruption issues around them. But I think that what they require actually, because their concept is good, their objectives, very good, that what they require is just to reform them, rather than throwing away the baby and the bathwater, okay? Because if you noticed, in 2016, in the thick of the economic recession that we had, agri sector was even growing at as high as 4%, all right? But today, I've just given you the growth rate, 0.18%. So central bank needs to support by also intervening. Even if he's not doing that directly, maybe it should be through the development finance institutions. But the trouble here is that the DFIs are weak. And that's why I think that while we are in the process of reviving the DFIs, the central bank can resume interventions in the agri space, to ensure that food output in general is boosted.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Uwaleke, for your time this afternoon on Newsday. Thank you very much for joining us.